and I would love to welcome everyone to tonight's Citizens Climate University. It's a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is specifically going to provide us an overview of Canada's emerging climate action plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And to do that, we're joined by a wonderful guest, Dr. David Maenz. David, if you allow me to do a quick introduction, received his PhD from the University of Saskatchewan and held several academic positions prior to co-founding MCN Bioproducts back in 2001. Dr. Maenz is the inventor or co-inventor of 7 different patents and the author of 33 papers and 2 book chapters, is retired from business interests and lives in Saskatoon. What we're also excited to do tonight is share a little bit more about a book he just wrote called The Price of Carbon. It was written and researched over a 2-year period by David as a scientist with a general interest in the interrelated subjects of industrialization and population growth, along with the science of climate change, current practices and sources of emissions, and looking ahead at future climate scenarios, as well as technical pathways to decarbonize all of our sectors. So David's really going to jump into the weeds tonight with the Canadian view, and to get us there, we're going to do a 3-part agenda. So we'll first zoom in specifically to the emerging climate action plan in Canada, and David's going to be really looking at the level of ambition that Canada has, comparing the federal backstop policy to a lot of the other provincial policies that are already out there. He's then going to scale up and look at the comparison of Canada's plan to the Energy Innovation Act, as well as the larger global context. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, Brett, and thanks to Citizens Climate Education for the invitation to give this talk. And I'll start going back to October 23rd of this year, when the federal government in Canada announced that the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change would be implemented. And this is an example of some real visionary leadership on the part of the government of Canada. So before going into the details of the plan, I'll just provide an overview of the profile of greenhouse gas emissions from Canada. So in 2016, these totaled about 700 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This equals 1.6% of the global total. And you'll hear people who will say that, well, 1.6%, whatever Canada does or does not accomplish is not going to influence the degree of global warming going forward. However, you have to step back from this. 35% of global emissions come from Canada, plus the large group of countries outside of the EU that have similar rates or lower rates of emission than Canada. So if all of these countries were to not take care of their regional obligations, then the result would be catastrophic. In addition, Canada, as an advanced economy, has an obligation to acknowledge the reality of climate change and to take effective actions to reduce emissions within its borders. So if you look at the profile of emissions from Canada, the oil and gas sector is responsible for about 26% of the total emissions, and this reflects the fact that Canada has a lot of reserves. And a lot of these emissions consist of methane released from upstream oil and gas sector activities. Emissions from transportation and building sector are similar to advanced economies. Emissions from the supply of electricity are well below what you normally see, in fact, less than half of. And the reason for this is extensive hydro resources that are well used in Canada. And in the province of Ontario, we've continued use of nuclear power and shutdown of all of the coal power stations happened over the last decade. The remaining emissions come from heavy industry, agriculture, and waste. And if you look at the provincial breakdown of emissions, Only 15% of the population in Canada live in the oil and gas rich provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. However, these two provinces account for almost half of total emissions. And on a per person basis, the intensity of emissions from Alberta and Saskatchewan is about 5-fold greater than the per capita emissions from the remaining provinces. So if Canada is going to meet its international obligations under the Paris Agreement, all of the provinces within the country are required to contribute on a fair share basis to emissions reductions. So what the Pan-Canadian framework is, it's a backstop plan that will come into place, and it's based on some minimal standards of carbon pricing, and will be applied to provinces that do not have stringent climate action plans. And the core of the backstop is a minimum carbon price starting at $20 a ton, and this will be applied to fuels as of April of next year. And this carbon price will increase at $10 increments on an annual basis, arriving at $50 Canadian by 2022. In addition to the carbon pricing, there's a system of output-based allocations that will apply to companies that are running in emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries. And I'll describe this in a little more detail on the next slide. Additional policies under the PCF include phase out of all remaining coal-fired power plants by 2030, a reduction in emissions, or I should say policies to reduce methane emissions from upstream oil and gas sectors, and this is to arrive at a 40 to 45% cut in these methane emissions by 2025, and implementation of the clean fuel standards. And this applies minimal standards of life cycle carbon intensity to fuels. This last policy should really result in about a 4% cut in national emissions. So output-based allocations and carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is a phenomena whereby emissions from a region that has effective carbon pricing relocate to another region that doesn't have carbon pricing in place. And this usually is a result of a physical relocation of activities of companies. And these companies are usually working under emissions-intensive, trade-exposed. So there are a number of policies or approaches that one can take to limit this potential for carbon leakage. And output-based allocations are one of these policies. And the idea is here to minimize the incentive for carbon leakage, while retaining an incentive for the companies to reduce emissions through their own practices. Okay, so these graphs are taken from Canada's Ecofiscal Commission website, and they provide an explanation of how output-based allocations work. So basically what we see here is 4 firms that are operating in the same industry, and they all have different intensities of emissions per unit of product. So in this case, we see release of CO2 per barrel of oil released. Firm A has the highest efficiencies, and the other firms, there's more emissions per unit of product formed. So what happens then is that you apply the standard that you want to achieve to the firm that has the most efficient practices. Then emissions credits are issued to each of the companies. In the case of firm A, emissions credits would equal the actual emissions that would be released by the company. For the less efficient companies, they will release more emissions above their credits. These credits can then be bought and sold on the open market. And after the reporting period, then emissions that are in excess of credits in hand, the company must pay the carbon pricing that's in place in the jurisdiction. So what this intends to do is to soften the costs for these emissions-intensive trade-exposed companies, but retain the incentive for them to improve their efficiencies of practices in terms of emissions reductions. Okay, output-based allocation systems cannot become havens for emissions for companies to basically hide and continue emissions. Ideally, these systems are temporary and transparent, and these systems are not required when you see symmetry of carbon pricing between jurisdictions. So in the absence of, or I should say, if you do have symmetry in carbon pricing between jurisdictions, there is no need for output-based allocations, and these industries can operate under standard carbon pricing systems. Okay, so the Pan-Canadian framework is based on the concept of cooperation between the federal government and the provinces, whereby the provinces were given 2 years to come up with effective climate action plans. And we did see this for British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. All of these provinces have climate action plans in place that are compliant with the Pan-Canadian framework. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick are not compliant, and the backstop mechanism of the Pan-Canadian framework will be imposed upon these provinces. So let's take a look at the climate action plans for provinces that are compliant. And in Quebec, they have a cap and trade system that covers 80% of provincial emissions. This cap and trade system is linked to the California system and is core to one of the world's most ambitious climate action plans. The emissions reductions target for Quebec are basically in line with recommendations for advanced economies. They want to hit a 20% reduction by the year 2020, advancing to 37.5% by 2030, and deep decarbonization by mid-century. And these reductions are relative to emissions on record for 1990. So in Quebec, they've already achieved, at least by the year 2015, a 10% cut in emissions. Quebec's electricity supply sector, it's almost entirely based on hydro, so there's zero emissions coming from production of electricity. And on a per capita basis, the intensity of emissions in Quebec is half of the national average. So moving on to British Columbia, in 2008, BC introduced a carbon fee. This covers 70% of provincial emissions, and the current rate of the carbon fee is $35 per ton, and it increases at annual increments of $5 a year. Emission target reductions are set to achieve targets based on emissions on record for 2007, and the idea is to hit a 40% reduction by 2030, advancing to 60% by 2040, and deep decarbonization by mid-century. So recently, Alberta has introduced a carbon levy, and this applies to major fuels. It's set at $30 per ton. Alberta is planning to phase out remaining coal-fired power plants by the year 2030. Alberta also uses a system of output-based allocations that applies to heavy industry, and they have introduced an overall cap on oil sands emissions. So even though Alberta is a province it's a very intense emitter, it has put together a climate action plan that does meet the stringency of the Pan-Canadian framework. So let's take a look at non-compliant provinces, and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. The Pan-Canadian framework will be imposed upon these provinces. And when the system was announced in October of last year, the revenue recycling model was also announced. And the way this works is fees collected from the province go back to the province and are paid to households on a dividend basis. So what happens then in Saskatchewan, because of the high intensity of emissions, the actual payments per household are much higher than they are in Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And if you take a close look at these rebates relative to cost, it's estimated that for most households, the rebates will exceed the additional cost incurred by these households with carbon fees. Okay, so this analysis here indicates why it's important for the backstop measure. And what I've done here is I'm comparing emissions from British Columbia and Saskatchewan. And there's two periods here between 2000 and 2007. This is prior to BC's implementation of carbon pricing. And then from 2008 to 2016, after the carbon pricing was initiated. So in British Columbia, there's been an absolute cut in emissions of about 5% since the carbon pricing was put in place. Fossil fuel sales, and this is impressive, have dropped by 17%. Detailed economic analysis completed at the University of Ottawa estimates that carbon pricing in BC has led to a drop of somewhere between 5 and 15% in emissions in comparison to what would have happened in the absence of carbon pricing. In comparison, Saskatchewan has not had a carbon price or a meaningful climate action plan in place up until 2018. Emissions in Saskatchewan have increased by 7.5% when you compare these two periods. And gasoline sales have increased by, believe it or not, 30% when you compare these two periods. Now, one of the things that may be said is, oh, this could be because of a difference in economic growth, and this is not the case. Both provinces have done very well over this period and have seen sustained strong economic growth, and it's almost identical to growth in GDP. And if you look at the intensity of emissions, and in Saskatchewan, 67 tons of carbon dioxide are emitted per person in 2016. This is 5-fold greater than the per capita intensity from BC. In BC, this has dropped by 13.5%, while little change in the emissions intensity per capita has happened in Saskatchewan in comparing these two periods. So this assessment then provides a real strong indication of the effectiveness of carbon pricing when you compare it to a province that did not have any climate action plan. Okay, the Pembina Institute has put together this, this simulator that anyone can go online and access it, and it allows the user to put in all manner of climate action policies and to look at the effect of various policies on emissions reductions. So in this simulation that I ran here, this is the Pan-Canadian framework with carbon pricing extended beyond 2022. So the $10 increment per year just continues on indefinitely. And when you run this simulation, emissions will drop such that Canada will achieve its 2030 target under the Paris Climate Agreement. And emissions will continue to drop to mid-century. If you remove carbon pricing from the Pan-Canadian framework, you basically tear the heart out of the entire system, and there's very little for emission reductions. If you increase the carbon price, you get a steeper reduction of emissions. Okay, so what's this going to cost? Canada's Ecofiscal Commission completed a study on the cost of carbon pricing, and in this case, they modeled a starting of $30 per metric ton, advancing to $100 by 2027, and they expressed the cost as the effects on average annual growth rates. So these scenarios that I'm showing here, they differ by the method of recycling of carbon-free revenues back into the economy. We see a transfer to households, traditional support of industry, and cuts to taxes, and finally taking those carbon fees and investing them into clean technologies. The take home from this study is that the costs are marginal. In fact, they're within the error of measurement, regardless of the system of recycling that is utilized. Okay, the study goes on then to compare the costs of a policy framework that did not include carbon pricing. So what this is then is it's a very complex framework of command and control, regulations, rebates, and mandates that is put in to achieve the same thing as you would with carbon pricing. And with this complex scenario, it can be done, but you are not accessing the efficiencies of the marketplace. And the cost advantage of carbon pricing is enormous. The Ecofiscal Commission estimates that a pure regulatory approach without carbon pricing would cost Canada's economy about 3.8% of GDP. This is equivalent to a recession when you compare this to a carbon pricing based system designed to achieve similar levels of emission reduction. So the question then, is revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend the best carbon pricing mechanism for Canada? And if we woke up tomorrow and all of the nations on Earth had overnight agreed to implement a global cap and trade system with covering 100% of emissions, with completely free trading of allowances between countries and unhindered access to all technologies, this would be the most cost-effective way to drive down emissions. This isn't going to happen, and it's something that's not going to happen. One could also say that in terms of recycling of fees, would it not be better to put this investment into clean infrastructure? Finally, one could say that what's the big deal with revenue neutral? Perhaps we're at a very critical situation where we have to invest beyond the revenues that would come in from carbon pricing. So with all these considerations, you could say technically, perhaps revenue neutral carbon fees with dividend payments to household may not be the best system. Forget all that, what I just said, because practically this system is understandable by the public, it's transparent, and ultimately it's supported by the public. After the details were announced, or I should say, let's back up, prior to the announcement of the details, 55% of Canadians were against carbon pricing. When the details were announced that the system would entail recycling of revenues via dividend payments to households, the acceptance went up to such that most Canadians are now in favor of carbon pricing. And you have to have public acceptance of carbon pricing mechanisms. It's vital. So we look at it from this perspective, revenue neutral carbon fee with dividend payments to households is the best option. Okay, so how does Canada's Climate Action Plan compare to the U.S. Energy Innovations Act that has been introduced to the floor of the House of Representatives? And is there a sufficient level of ambition within Canada's emerging climate action plan? And finally, how will this plan fit in with the global scenario of climate change mitigation? Okay, as everyone is aware, in 2015, the Conference of Parties to the original United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed that, and this is basically all nations on Earth, agreed to limit future surface temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Each country or group of countries was to set their own targets for emission reductions. And most countries submitted pledges to reduce or control emissions by the year 2030 relative to a baseline level. In the case of Canada, we pledged to reduce year 2030 emissions by 30% relative to emissions on record for the year 2005. Okay, so this graph is adapted from the United Nations Environmental Program 2018 emissions gap report. And the emissions lines here actually go down the middle of broader bands that encompass the uncertainties within these emissions. But for clarity's sake, I'm just showing lines here. And if you look at the emission reduction pathways, the three of them here, they all reach peak emissions in about the year 2020 and then decline from there. Reaching emissions in 2020 and then declining has the highest probability of success and comes at the lowest cost of implementation. So starting with the dark blue line here, this is a pathway projection based on a continuation of current policies. Emissions would go up past the year 2030, and by the end of the century, we would impose 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in future surface warming. The green line shows a 2 degree Celsius pathway, and this arrives at zero emissions in the latter decades of the century. Under the Paris Agreement, all nations agreed to limit future surface warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The purple line here is a 1.8 degrees Celsius pathway. It goes down steeper and arrives at zero emissions somewhere around the year 27. There's not much left in a budget of emissions under a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. What has to happen here is a steep reduction. We have to cut emissions by somewhere between 40 to 55% by the year 2030, and then arrive at zero emissions by mid-century. Most of these models envision negative emissions in the second half of the century, whereby you would compensate for extra emissions beyond the budget in the first part of the century. Negative emissions is accomplished by massive programs of afforestation and reforestation, such that you've got a huge potential of carbon sequestered biomass on the planet. And most of these models also envision industrial carbon dioxide withdrawal. So right now, we are sitting in a situation with current practices by the year 2030 with much higher rates of emissions in comparison to 1.8 and 1.5. So we've got huge gaps here. And what has to happen is that the level of ambition of almost all nations on Earth to reduce emissions must increase to overcome these emission gaps. So now if we could take a look at some numbers. And this is a study that just came out quite recently from the University of Stanford, published in Nature. And this group of researchers estimates the cost of damage from unmitigated climate change to be equivalent to losing 25 to 35% of global GDP on an annual basis in the latter decades. And then if you look at the costs entailed of a 1.8 degree pathway, and this is estimates taken from the International Energy Agency's 2018 World Energy Outlook. And this is the cost of transitioning the energy sector as required. This would only cost, with these estimates, about 1/4% of GDP over the next few years. And this goes up to a little more than 0.5% of GDP from 2060 to 2040. And the energy sector is the heavy lifter of all of the cost of transition. So when you look at cost versus inaction, it's a no-brainer. There is no moral, or economic justification for inaction on the part of the current generation of decision makers. With the UNEP emissions gap report, they also look at potential for emissions abatement by economic sector. And this shows emissions abatement potential with carbon pricing in place at $100 a ton by 2030 as the main economic driver. There's a huge opportunity to reduce emissions in the energy sector, and this would follow improved energy efficiencies across economic sectors, shutdown of coal power plants, and transition to zero and low emissions options for production of electricity. There's considerable opportunities to reduce emissions from industry through electrification of practices and through improved energy efficiencies. Some of the lowest cost abatements can be found in the forestry sector through land use management programs that would reduce rates of deforestation and promote promote afforestation and reforestation to build up the biomass of carbon sequestering forests. We've seen tremendous advances in electrification of vehicles in the last few years. It costs about 20% to charge an electric vehicle, the costs are about 20% of the cost of fueling a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle. So there's a huge opportunity to reduce emissions by fleet change over to electric vehicles over the next few years. There are also emission reduction opportunities in agriculture and buildings. So if you add up all of these emission abatements, and that's what's shown here on the black line, technically it is possible to reduce emissions at an extent to easily overcome the 2 degree and 1.5 degree emissions gap. It's a little different under the very demanding situation of a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And basically we're pushing the technical threshold here. And to be quite frank, it's going to require a sustained dedication of purpose from all countries to limit future surface warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so Climate Action Tracker. Climate Action Tracker is the product of 4 of the world's top policy institutes that look at climate change. And what this mechanism does is it looks at the emissions from each of the top countries and looks at their climate action plans and then rates them as to where they're at. So this is the Climate Action Tracker assessment of Canada's contribution to the global effort. And if you look at the dark green line here, this would be emissions from Canada aligned with a world of well below 1.5 degrees Celsius in future surface warming. The light green is emissions aligned with a world less than 1.5. The yellow, emissions aligned with less than 2 degrees. The orange, less than 3. The red, less than 4 degrees. And the brown would be emissions rate from Canada aligned with other countries that would be consistent with over 4 degrees of future surface warming. The dark line is historical emissions. The blue wedge is projections to the year 2030 based on current policies. So based on current policies, we would contribute to between 3 and 4 degrees of future surface warming. The purple line is based on successful implementation of the Pan-Canadian framework. It doesn't reach Paris pledges because right now carbon pricing stops at $50 a ton. And as I indicated before, if this carbon price is extended past 22, then you will hit our Paris pledges. This degree or level of emission is consistent with between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius in future surface warming. Okay, so this is Climate Action Tracker's assessment of global ratings for all of the major emitters. Canada is currently in the highly insufficient category and consistent with 3 to 4 degrees of Celsius in future surface warming. If we can implement the Pan-Canadian framework, we'll be moved over to the insufficient category. Let's rise above the noise and look down into a room that has the major emitters of the world in this room. And the size of the circle is indicative of the total contribution to global emissions. And the color follows Climate Action Tracker's ratings of the climate action plans in each of these countries or group of countries. The United States of America is the elephant in the room. And canceling of the Clean Power Plant was a real step backwards. And it resulted in Climate Action Tracker changing the rating from the US from highly insufficient to critically insufficient. And yes, there's some momentum at the municipal and state level, but this doesn't compensate for the lack of leadership on climate action at the highest levels of government in the United States. And frankly, House Representatives, the Senate, and the White House itself have to become engaged with the Paris Agreement. And again, to be somewhat blunt, the Energy Innovation Act, it can't fail. It's got to come through, or something similar to it, such that the leadership comes from this very large economy, and the world can then get its act together and move toward effective global climate action. And moving forward. Okay, so main summaries. Number one, as of April of 2019, Canada will have a significant set of climate action plans in place with effective carbon pricing mechanisms in place right across the country. PFC, or Pan-Canadian Framework compliant provinces, will have climate action plans that consist of a mixture of policies and carbon pricing mechanisms. The Pan-Canadian Framework will be imposed on non-compliant provinces by extending the annual incremental increase in carbon pricing past the year 22. Canada should be able to achieve its Paris pledges. The US simply must re-engage with the Paris Agreement at the national level. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act has considerable symmetry with Canada's climate action plan. And this is a real good news story. It's an emerging story here because it provides the opportunity rather for an alignment of carbon pricing in North America. And once this happens, the potential for carbon leakage disappears, and this allows for an overall strengthening of ambition to curtail emissions. We have seen this type of cooperation happen in the past, and under the Obama administration, Canada, the US, and Mexico agreed to a 45% cut in methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. So with strong leadership in these three countries, it is possible, in my mind, to get this type of cooperation that could eventually lead to a North American carbon pricing system. Okay, the current level of Canada's climate action plan is not consistent with a fair share contribution to limit surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Canada, the US, and all countries must advance the level of ambition within their climate action plans to approach a fair share contribution to the global effort. In general, for advanced economies, a target of about a 40 to 45% cut in emissions by the year 2030 should be in place, and this must advance to deep decarbonization of greater than 80% cut at least by mid-century. So is there a possibility of a global scenario to up the level of ambition? A symmetrical, ideally borderless carbon pricing zone could potentially be established in North America early in the next decade. And this would be based on the symmetry that we've seen from the Energy Innovation Act and the Pan-Canadian Framework. Once this is in place, emerging climate leadership in North America could collaborate with carbon pricing zones in Europe, China, and India, such that we could see then a coordinated global advance in ambition and timelines for transitions as required to achieve a sustainable development scenario that limits future surface warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius if we really push things, perhaps even 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the final take-home message, globally, a continuation of current policies will result in 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in surface warming at a projected cost of 25 to 35% of global GDP lost on an annual basis to future generations. Global implementation of well-designed climate action plans based on a foundation of carbon pricing will initiate decarbonization, and eventually we'll see higher costs come in by mid-century as you get into higher cost abatements. So the question then, can we afford this? And the answer, absolutely. What we cannot afford is inaction. Okay, and this is just a list of some of the references that I've used here. These three institutes are probably three of the better organizations in Canada that put out very good information on assessment of climate policies, etc. And here are the websites. Okay, I just want to let everybody know that my book is available for purchase. It's available online. Mark Reynolds was kind enough to provide a fairly strong endorsement of the book. And if we jump forward, you can purchase the book online from Amazon or Chapters Indigo. It's available in hardcover, softcover, and electronic versions. Best way to do this is to go to the website of the Price of Carbon, and then a couple clicks later, you're at the position where you can purchase the book if you're interested. If anybody wants a signed copy, just contact me directly and I will make that happen. And with that, I turn this over to Brett.
Oh, bravo, Dave. I've put your link and the website in the chat window as well. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to both Dave and I afterwards. Dave has been generous enough to provide his email as well as mine here. It's dave@thepriceofcarbon.com. And mine is brett@citizensclimate.org. And Dave, we just want to close by just giving a huge round of applause from all of us here. CCL is so grateful for your work, for your ongoing research and translating everything that you've done in a really distilled, succinct manner. And we hope that we can continue to collaborate and learn from what you've done. And we want to also thank everyone on the line tonight. Thank you for making it. We hope you found tonight's webinar useful, and we look forward to continuing to work together across the border. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, David.
I'll unmute all lines. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.